I think one of the major misconceptions about first-year writing teachers is that all we do is teach grammar. And as first-year writing teachers, you're going to run into that a lot. People will be asking you about that question. So for instance, last night I was at a dinner, in fact, and somebody asked me, he was a professor who had retired, don't you find that your students use amount when they should use number, the word number? And these questions are always reoccurring. You'll always have people asking you about how your students are doing grammatically, because the assumption is that that's what we do. We teach grammar. The real thing about this, though, is that grammar is such a small part of what we do. There's so many other more important things to be focusing on than grammar in the classroom. And when it boils down to it, even if we were to focus on grammar specifically in the classroom, even if we were to lecture, say, on comma splices one day in class, your students are going to come back the next day and still have comma splices in their essay. Research has shown that it doesn't really do all that much good if you stand up and lecture in a decontextualized way about grammar issues in the classroom. And one of the reasons for that is because the more complex the tasks become that you assign your students, the more they focus in on the complex parts of that task, the things that are really causing them issues. So if they're struggling with ideas, then the grammar goes by the wayside. The things that they've been able to do for years, they know these rules, but they know these rules, but to a certain extent, students aren't able to reproduce them under certain conditions because they're struggling with some other things that are more important. So grammar becomes something that's added on at the end. And so that's one thing to keep in mind when you're teaching grammar, is that if students are struggling at a certain stage in their composing process with the ideas, let's say, something that's more complex, make sure that you schedule some time in class for students to go back then and proofread what they've done, because they'll catch a lot of these errors themselves. There is something called minimal marking, which is a technique that Rich Haswell created, where you actually, instead of correcting students' essays in terms of their grammatical errors, you just mark in the margin with like a check mark, say, where you see these problems, and then students can go back in and spend more time working on that. That allows you to save your important responding time for the more complex ideas that you're focusing on. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about. Oh, the last thing to keep in mind is that if you wanted to teach grammar to your students, the best way to do that is to contextualize that grammar lesson. So for instance, if you see students making a repeated error in their essay, then maybe after a few essays or one or two essays, it's important to point that out to your students to say, hey, I'm noticing that you're making this mistake. Make an effort to correct it in the future. This is something that actually worked really well for me when I was in college. I can still remember a professor that I had. Her name was Susan Callahan, and she worked at Northern Illinois University. And I was taking an advanced writing class with her, and she just mentioned to me one day in the margin, you often use a lot of vague pronouns. And it just clicked with me. Yeah, she's right, I do. And I still do to this day. It's still something that I struggle with, and I always have to go back through and double check what I've written to make sure that I'm not doing that. The reason that it doesn't matter why I do it, I suppose. I do know why I do it, but the fact that she pointed that out to me is something that I still hang on to this day. So for instance, if you guys can make that same connection with your students, hey, you're making this mistake on a regular basis, make sure that you check for it. That can be something that can be powerful for your students, so that as they're reading or rereading and proofreading their essays in the future, they'll hang on to that and they'll check specifically for that error. And doing that can be really successful, whereas a decontextualized version where you just say, here's what a comma splice is. Fix it in the future if that doesn't work as well.